So she was an expert witness in this case where the perpetrator was brought to court because the daughter accused him of molesting her in her bedroom. She had a camera with an ultraviolet lens or something, which could pick up images in the dark. There was concrete proof that he was doing the crimes, but the jury dismissed the case and found the molester not guilty.
I'm not sure who's heard of the false memory syndrome, but in the late 80s, several women survivors were suing their perpetrators. The lawyer would get a psychologist or psychiatrist to testify, and they would call these false memories that were induced by the therapist. That really shut it down. It wasn't about sharing our voices with each other. It was about trying to use the legal system to confront.
It's going to be a dual presentation, two women, Batya Weinbaum and Sue Gittins. The title is quite a serious one. They are going to tell us about whatever happened to the incest survivors movement.
I'm Batya Weinbaum, and I'm actually from the US. I'm a writer, activist, theorist, artist, editor. So, I want to say it's wonderful that we're here, and it was a great experience working with other survivors to develop this presentation. And our intent was to help fill in the pieces for other women who might not benefit from what we benefited from when we were realizing our incest experience. And the idea came out of a breakout room after a radical feminist perspective discussion about the Women Against Violence Against Women, which was a great discussion, but I think there were 3 survivors in the meeting, and we came up with the idea to propose this feminist question time talk. And we're going to talk about the origins of this movement in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and how it grew out of the grassroots feminist critique of Freud and the therapy model, and how it spread largely through women-only spaces, and how it was part of the Women Against Violence movement, and how women coming together to share on our experience of child sexual abuse with other family members changed our lives. We would also explore the factors contributing to this movement's demise and where that leaves survivors today. And we're going to review some of the writing that's come out. How childhood sexual abuse can impact your life. A feeling of scatteredness, feeling of dissociation, a lot of fight or flight because it was so hard to fight with the authority figure or family member who is abusing you. And there's a lot of splitting, like leaving your stuff in different places and then going to the other place when you feel afraid in the first place. Because the primary thing for an incest survivor is the need for safety. And some people look at us from the outside and say, well, money is more important, or this is more, and the safety is the most important thing for an incest survivor. And that's what we started to learn. The theorist who put a lot of this together with the concept of PTSD is Judith Herman. She published a book in 1992 called Trauma and Recovery. And I think Sue's going to go into the details of what that book says. But before that book came out, there was a lot of misdiagnosis. Women would go in to therapy if they had the wherewithal to get there at all, and they'd be called different names like multiple personality or borderline, or the labels put on by the outside that didn't get into the inside of how and why people were expressing those symptoms. And so that was very detrimental to a lot of women, and didn't lead to healing or help, because many women got institutionalized and psychiatrized and then became active in the anti-psychiatry movement, where again we met each other and shared experiences of how we'd gotten in there in the first place. And a lot of this misdiagnosis was challenged by the social worker Florence Rush. She called it the Freudian cover-up, the sexual abuse of children, a feminist point of view. And she actually gave that paper in 1971 at the New York Radical Feminist Rape Conference. And she saw girls or children as seducers and as victims, not as seducers, which is how they were seen in Freudian psychology. And then, so this emerged in the context of the violence against women. There were a lot of speakouts about rape going on. In 1978, Louise Armstrong did a book that she calls a speak out in book form, Kiss Daddy Goodnight. And one of the books that was also very influential was Ellen Bass's Courage to Heal, that she wrote with Laura Davis. It was published in 1988. It was controversial, but it was a very influential. And then most important was the emergence of the incest survivor support networks, and these like workshops given at Michigan at the Women's Music Festival, and there would be a title on the program, and women would come and hear about the incest survivors movement, and then, you know, go through what they did in terms of connecting with other incest survivors when they left. There was this Incest Survivors Anonymous. There were a lot of publications where we were putting our work, our experiences, our poetry, our art, and some of them, one of them was called Breaking Free in the late 70s and early 80s. Then there was Voices in Action in the 80s, which was a result of an activist group publishing something. Then there was the Incest Survivors Network newsletter. These were only 3 of them. There were many. And it was very healing to have these outlets, and they were usually they were always edited by survivors themselves, and often in chapters or, you know, local groups were putting these out. So there was also coverage in the feminist press, you know, like Chrysalis and Off Our Backs, but these self-produced zines, sometimes they were 8 pages, they were typed and copied by the incest survivors themselves. They're hard to find now. You'd have to look in archives to find most of them. But it was interesting to find out there were so many, because they were helpful to me in my life. And like I said, the workshop, I think my first contact was at a workshop in the 80s in Michigan Women's Music Festival. So, but what's key is that this movement spread through women-only spaces. You know, we weren't fighting about keeping men out or who could be there. We were talking about our own problems with each other. And women were changing their lives by sharing their stories. And the factors contributing to the demise, I'm not sure who's heard of the false memory syndrome, but in the late 80s, several women survivors were suing their perpetrators. And then the perpetrators, yeah, there was a lot in Madness Network News. You're right about that. Thank you for mentioning that. There were the perpetrator's lawyer would get a psychologist or psychiatrist to testify, and they would call these false memories that were induced by the therapist that the incest survivor was going to. And that really shut it down a lot, because it wasn't about sharing our voices with each other. It was about trying to use the legal system to confront. And so some people thought that wasn't worth it. It was very difficult for the woman survivor. And then there was this backlash that grew. And so where does this leave the incest survivors today? Because of the PTSD analysis of our situation, there are a lot of younger women, well, younger than myself, who went to graduate school and learned about trauma. And so it's possible to go to a younger woman therapist who's really into trauma and identifying, you know, they're not labeling you schizophrenic or borderline. They're saying you have PTSD, so women can get help more. But what's happened with the growth of the, you know, trauma therapy movement is that a lot of the survivor movements are are diminished. So there were those two factors, the growth of therapy and the general shutdown of the women's movement. So it's three factors, and the false memory syndrome. There's this kind of attempt to get situated in outer reality, because when you get triggered, you go way back into your head, and then you need to connect with the outer reality. So these are the kinds of drawings that we were publishing in those newsletters and zines. So here's a picture I did more recently of the soul looking at the phone. So all the energy is out looking down at this little device, not connected with the room. That's dissociation. So sometimes when I get really dissociated, I start drawing, and you notice I use a lot of bright colors. So next picture. I agree it's difficult to talk about it, but I must say I've been on a lot of Zooms, and this movement was going on all around the world. So here's the energy of the person, bigger and out of sync with the external environment. I don't know if you can see that, but it's a healing method when you start feeling dissociated, is to do that. And at the time, not only was there an incest survivor movement, but there were women's art galleries and a women's art movement. So there was some way to work on this kind of art and have it discussed and shown and everything. So then a lot of incest survivors, when they start showing art, it's called childish. There's like the happiness to be in your body and leaping up. But a lot of my art gets called childish because it's coming from the inner child that's trying to heal. Okay, so this is a large canvas, and it's called Sunrise Dispels Darkness. But sometimes when you do that, coming back from dissociation art, and then you do the leaping into the space art, underneath is a lot of pain. And it's hard to show this. Like, you know, I'm in Gulfport now. You can't go into the Gulfport art galleries with art like this. And I was asked to contribute to the Ohio Feminist Art Museum that's starting. And in the discussion, I mentioned a lot of rape and incest pictures, and they were like, art, did they want that? They wanted the goddess stuff, but they weren't sure. They had to have a discussion. They finally figured out it was okay, but there was a hesitance to include incest art and rape art. Okay, so I don't know if you can read the words on this, but this is a coffin with a girl lying in it, and then it says something about died from incest, and there are all of these feelings buried in the ground. So that's the thing. There might be sketchiness trying to get back in touch with reality. There might be childish leaping. There might be underground pain, but it's all because we're trying to come back from feeling dead inside. Okay, so this is the first cemetery slide that I did. And then I found out other artists, incest survivor artists, were making this kind of art. And so, you know, here lies Betty dead from incest at the age of 4. So there's this deadness. So sometimes, you know, you might be talking to a survivor and they don't seem to be in touch with what you're saying because they're going into this dead feeling inside and then struggling against it. And that takes up more energy in the mind than following the conversation sometimes. So the person might feel like a beat was skipped and they're not listening, or they're not so smart because they missed some points that were made. Or so anyway, these are the kinds of experiences. We told our stories, we shared. Where we're left today, I think the language has changed. There's even a new book out by Oprah that she wrote with a psychologist, where it talks about what happened to us instead of what we are. So it's infiltrated into the lingo of mass culture. And thank you for the opportunity to share. And I look forward to more dialogue. I do want to say that a lot of the groups that I'm on, like Zoom groups, when I mentioned I was going to do this talk, people started sharing their stories in the activist movement of the 80s and their experiences now. So thank you. Now we're going to go on to Sue, who's actually in the UK, and she has a lot to share as well.
Something's going to happen whenever you start talking about survival from incest or survival from sexual abuse. Something always happens. And it's my experience that what happens is that another woman, a light bulb goes on, or something happens in her consciousness, and she says, yeah, that's me too. Yeah, I'm in that club. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about, first of all, trauma and recovery and some of the things that Judith Lewis Herman says. From the moment I read the first chapter, I knew again I was in this group. I belonged in humanity. I belonged in a human group, not in my own isolated, terrible. Well, I felt like I was in a tomb a lot of the time. So she makes some amazing claims and they're beautifully expressed. And I hope that I've picked some that will help you. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. To speak publicly about one's knowledge of atrocities is to invite the stigma that attaches to victims. The study of psychological trauma has an underground history. She says that she wrote a paper on incest with Lisa Hirschman in 1976, and it circulated underground in manuscript for a year before it was published. It was underground because it was forbidden to a certain extent. And in this quotation, she points to something very, well, it's quite terrifying, really, but it's really how this works, how it's not a political movement, it's not an organized movement. It doesn't need to be, because the perpetrators have their club, they have their bonding, and they carry on doing what they're doing. And we are survivors of small, hidden concentration camps created by tyrants who rule their homes. And then my last quotation is what her aim and ambition is. I have tried to find a language that can withstand the imperatives of doublethink and allows all of us to come a little closer to facing the unspeakable. So thanks to Judith Lewis Herman, she's brilliant, and the whole thing swings along the whole book and takes you with her. And I found it so supportive, and it changed my language, and it enabled me to think and write and talk to other survivors. When you were talking, Batya, earlier about the history of incest survivor groups, what the history was, and what contributed to the demise, you called it, of the movement. And in the book Coercive Control by Evan Stark, there's a useful, I think, very useful historical summary of the history of domestic violence provisions in the 1970s and funding for such provisions, and how that faded away by the end of the 80s. So it had a sort of 15, 20-year rise and then fell. And I found it interesting to look at the way the funding and the public support was tied in together. So I thought I'd mention that. One of my little fragments that I'm now going to share is some work I did with a young woman who was I was a hospital educator, and this young woman had been admitted to hospital for her own safety, so they said. And this made me think when I heard about reports of men in women's prisons, because the psychiatric unit in which she was housed was really small. She had to share corridors and bathrooms and facilities with sex offenders. And she was in that place for her survival, for her safety. Nonetheless, despite all the barriers in her way, she wrote an autobiographical piece, and we submitted it for her English GCSE exam. And she did really well at that. And it was a really proud moment for me when she finished it and brought it out into the world. It was called A Curse of Abuse. Never published, but was a really solid piece of work. And I thought something else that I'd share, which sort of sums up the culture that survivors live in. This is from a professional who has a very good reputation. She's a forensic anthropologist, and she was an expert. She was an expert witness in a child molestation case. So a man was molesting his teenage daughter over quite a long period of time, I think over a year. And the resourceful girl decided she would put her camera on. Yeah, so she was an expert witness in this case where the perpetrator was brought to court because the daughter accused him of molesting her in her bedroom. And she had a camera with a ultraviolet lens or something, which could pick up images in the dark. And she filmed him. She left her camera on and she had film of him molesting her. So not only had he been accused, not only had the charges been taken seriously and he'd gone to court, but there was concrete proof that he was doing the crimes that the victim accused him of. But the jury dismissed the case and found the molester not guilty. It's very powerful when Sue Black shares this, because she says that they said that the victim didn't cry. My next little fragment is it's a film that I think is fantastic, and other people think it's fantastic as well. But it is directed by a known offender called Roman Polanski. It stars a slightly a person with a dubious reputation. It stars John Huston and Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway. It's called Chinatown. It's one of the best things that I've ever seen about incest. This is the material we're dealing with. We're not dealing with child's play. We're dealing with the most depraved aspect of human behavior. And the scene that I'm thinking of is where Jack Nicholson is questioning Faye Dunaway about her relationship with her sister, or is it her daughter? Or is it her sister, or is it her daughter? And she says, she's my sister. She's my daughter. She's my sister. She's my daughter. She's my sister. She's my daughter. This is a book, what I made. I didn't actually. I repurposed it. It's a bound book. It's a bound copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I repurposed it with my own words and pictures. So that's the cover. And this is some of the insides of the book. So this is the title page. And that's a kind of self-portrait of how I felt. I felt like I was chained and I was underwater and I was just about to lose the capacity to breathe. And that's quite a common feeling with survivors. That's quite a common sort of experience. If you were going to write your own book, which I advise you to do if you're a survivor, I advise you to write. You don't have to write a book, write a shopping list, whatever you want to, but write it down, get it away from yourself and into another form. I would say that repurposing somebody else's book is quite a good way to start. This is a little sketch I did called Victimology. And it's victims in a structural role vis-a-vis perpetrators and where you get victims from. And I said, Jesus, he's the ultimate victim. The Jews, the victims of rape. And I thought of the Serbs who were in a civil war, losing a civil war and subject to what's it called? Genocide. And the Rwandans who were genocidally murdered. And then I thought of the expectation of what our performance should be. And we experience degradation, and I've put probably permanent. We're susceptible to patronage by non-victim class. That's a real sort of stab in the dark by me. But I feel as if I'm in a different class. If you're not a victim of abuse, then you're in a different class to me. But maybe you are in a different class and you don't feel like that, but I did. I've put willing to sustain stigmata. In other words, the wounds from this, as Batya pointed out, go very deep and they last very long. and they go much longer than one lifetime. And we are available. We become available, and we become mythologized, we become canonized, or we become exterminated. We're on a spectrum. Sometimes both at the same time. We're both canonized and exterminated. This is a piece from a piece of work by a friend of mine, remarkable woman, who has a Roman Catholic background. She did a series of sculptures, of which this is one, representing the Stations of the Cross, which, if you are of that faith, you'll know was the procession that the historical figure of Jesus was supposed to have taken on his way to be crucified. I think it speaks for itself and makes me cry, but it makes me rejoice too, because it's such a great piece of art. The whole piece is quite stunning. Well, it doesn't exist anymore, but it's in photographs, so it's got some existence now. That's the Stations of the Cross. So I too have done my coffin and funeral piece. This was part of a diorama called What Rape Kills. And so inside that coffin, there's the word is joy. Rape kills joy. And I think I had hope and truth also as one of the things that things that raped kills. I really laughed when Batya saw this picture because she said, "Is that a pot holder?" And I said, "No, it's not a pot holder, but it is. It's a pot holder if you want it to be." But it was my banner for my victims and survivors movement, which was called Never Again. So it was Never Again in various forms, in various languages. And this is a tiny piece that was in the banner. And I don't know if anybody from UK remembers the Sarah Everard case. Sarah Everard was seduced and murdered by a policeman. We got really cross about that. And along with lots of women in other parts of UK, we had a vigil in the town where I live. And it became a site where women brought flowers and tributes to Sarah. And there was a silent vigil. I somehow wanted to do something, so I took my little pot holder and I gave it to one of the police that was standing at the vigil. And I asked him to lay it down as part of the tributes. And the amazing thing was that he did so, and he did it so gently and so carefully, because as you can see, it's a small little floppy little piece of knitting. He did it so gently and carefully, and I thought that was action. Somehow that was some kind of action. I'll leave it up to you to say whatever you think, or think whatever you think about that. But I've only recently discovered that Mary Oliver, who, as you probably know, is a really well-known, well-regarded poet, wrote her own piece about incest. And I thought I'd share it because I thought it was a great poem. And the last piece is a segment from my memorial. What's it called? Reminiscences. I don't know. It's going to be a book of little stories about the past, and it's also going to trace my investigation into my family and why it was such a criminal family. Because this is actually, believe it or not, comparatively new for me. I'm a survivor that's only acknowledged that she's a survivor for the last 20 years, and I'm 78. So I'm doing some work on that. So the last piece will be a piece from that. But first of all, Rage by Mary Oliver. Rage. You are the dark song of the morning. Serious and slow, you shave, you dress, you descend the stairs in your public clothes and drive away. You become the wise and powerful one who makes all the days possible in the world. But you were also the red song in the night, stumbling through the house to the child's bed, to the damp rose of her body, leaving your bitter taste. And forever, those nights snarl the delicate machinery of the days. When the child's mother smiles, you see on her cheekbones a truth you will never confess, and you see how the child grows, timidly, crouching in corners. Sometimes in the wide night you hear the most mournful cry, a ravished and terrible moment. In your dreams she's a tree that will never come to leaf. In your dreams she's a watch you dropped on the dark stones till no one could gather the fragments. In your dreams you have sullied and murdered, and dreams do not lie. So this is an autobiographical fragment about my experience. Miss Pointer and the Treaty of Charlton. Mum juggles me, a precarious possibility between declamation, elocution lessons, national speaking competitions, and a radical silence, both deep and cold. She is propelled by the fierce compunction to have me get on, become in some way acceptable, assimilated. Camouflage is her game, social mobility her gambit. The more thorny project, the silencing, is aimed at damage limitation. I must be prevented from exposing the whole gig with my reckless speech. And the one facilitates the other. The nice, quiet, well-spoken girl will carry the expectation of virtue. The girl has been prepared, defanged, and will deliver precisely nothing to derange the required serenity. And who better to engineer this transformation from warrior to compliant nonentity? Mum is the primary victim. She will do nicely. In the simpler task, Mum enlists the aid of Miss Pointer, teacher of elocution, the first in a cohort of matriarchs lined up to mould me. Miss Pointer pouts a purple pout, monstrous, predatory. Her great bruise of a mouth terrorizes. Her techniques are various. The repetitions, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled pepper, round and round the ragged rock, the ragged rascal ran, are my litanies. Then there is deportment, leaned into by dint of genteel coercion, forceful inculcation. Pointer deploys strict drilling to pulverize my vowels to a pulp, gentrify me into a coma, constrain and straighten me. Every trace of woolage crudity, every scrap of the sparse, naked squalor Mum's ancestors knew, is swept away in an unstoppable tornado of received pronunciation, a deluge of chin lifts, step correction. I am remembering to forget. To the manner born I recite Nimble Hands in Ljubljana at the Poetry Society exam, an incredible, ridiculous concoction, but who cares? My vowels are pure East Sussex, my consonants are clipped. I stand straight. I have been brought to the pass and have been certified. The double cross is perfect. Between them, Mum and Pointer have sculpted a living doll who says nothing. By way of a great chorus, by way of Shakespeare sonnets and Milton, by way of mediocre wordsmiths, any filler will do, so long as it stops her, stops her, stops her. The deep-seated guffaw of derision in my guts I save for later. As for the reckless and muted testimony of Mum's bedroom at Cherry Tree Court, that stays and stays. It spills, splits and fissures, splays into repeated hairline and finer cracks throughout every scenario, every decade. If I laid 6 feet of concrete over my tail and waited 100 years, I could come back and found a forest of true trees, sprouted 200 feet high. Each branch and leaf would sing the dreadful litany of the original scene. Within each stem a bone, within each bone a course of marrow. Deep within that marrow, each microscopic trace without a sound would weep, would keen. You know, as do I, the cause. We know, because we are, this radical silence which we proclaim. This soundlessness is the price to be paid for continued enrollment. A membership fee for license to breathe the air, drink the water, be pronounced human. Mrs. Crisp knows it. We all know it. To protect, she must attack. To save, she must annihilate. Speech is the equivalent absence. This is the Treaty of Charlton.